Okay, I'm gonna give you guys a quick explanation of how I have my blocks set up because they might be a little bit different than other patterns that you've used. And I have two different examples here. So the first thing that I want to point out is that most of my quilts are made out of blocks instead of one huge paper piecing. And I do it in blocks because I feel like that makes it a little bit more user-friendly. I also like how it looks. Instead of any pieces that would be separate pieces of paper being printed out as separate pieces, it prints out as one block. Another reason why I do this is because usually the block fits easily on a regular piece of printer paper. So if you want to print it at home, you can print out one block at a time as you go. But one thing I want to point out here is that the blocks will have red lines. Now, I just realized on this block I chose that these don't look very red because my printer was running out of colored ink. But the red lines in my system mean that those are pieces that you have to cut separate. So these pieces are going to be cut apart and then sewn back together. Another thing I want to point out before I kind of show you what that would look like is that any pieces that will be cut apart often will be given labels. Like it might just say section 1, 2, 3. If it says section, like here, 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, that is telling you the order it needs to be sewn in. So if you look at this, it does need to be sewn in a specific order, because if I sewed this piece to this piece before I'd sewn this piece, I'll have to do a weird Y seam. And when you cut them out, I kind of place these so that you'll still have that label there, so you shouldn't get too mixed up. So if it says 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, that means I need to sew all section 1 together before I sew it to section 2. Now, if you just have a section 2, then once these are sewn together, you can sew them to section 2. But in this case, it has a 2A and 2B, so that means you need to sew those two together before they can be sewn to section 1. So where those red lines are, what you need to do is you need to cut the block out very carefully, and you can use your rotary blade if you want to make sure it's really straight. You want to cut these pieces out along that line. So now we can see we've cut the block up into separate pieces. So each of these pieces is a piece that's going to be sewn together. So let's look at this section 1A. So the way I've labeled the pieces is the letters determine the order. One of the reasons for that is because some of my patterns have a number to indicate the color of the fabric. So the letters help separate from that. But in a lot of these patterns, it'll say a letter and then a slash, and then this is going to be the code for the fabric. So if I see A here, B here, that means this is the first piece of fabric I'm going to place on my piece, and B is the second piece of fabric that I'm going to sew. So this is the first seam I'm going to do. Then once I've done A and B, C is over here, so this is the next seam I'm going to sew. And then D is last here, so this is the last seam I'm going to sew. Okay, as far as my key, red lines mean that you're going to cut along those lines. Black lines is where seams are going to be. And then I have two other colors that I want to point out. So in some of my patterns, blue lines are going to indicate the edge of the quilt. Now, in patterns where the blocks are not tilted, I don't do that because I don't find it's necessary. But when I have tilted blocks where you're going to have some weird shaped pieces and they're angled oddly, the blue is just kind of help you remember these are edge pieces, so that'll help you sort of put it together. And then the other color we have here is a green line. A green line represents a separation between two blocks. So this is where if there are two pieces that are small enough to fit on one paper, I just put both of the blocks on one paper. You'll notice here that the green line goes through the block. That means you do not cut that, you do not sew that. You kind of ignore it as you're sewing this block, but that line is there so that when you're trying to attach this to another block, you can line that green line up with the seam of the other, where the other two blocks meet, and that'll make it easier for you to see how you sew it together. if you were supposed to sew here, then this line would be black on the block, and then it would be a little green sticking out from beyond the block. One other thing that I want to point out is you'll notice that these pieces do not have seam allowances drawn on them. So you want to make sure that after you're done sewing this, that you cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'll show you how you can easily connect these back together. So here you can see I've sewn together a piece, and now I'm going to trim it. Sometimes I like to sew around the outside of the block because I feel like it helps keep the fabric together. And this is going to end up being inside the seam allowance so that you won't see it. So now I need to cut it so that I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side. Now you'll notice I have extra paper out there on the outside of the block. I didn't cut the block right along that line. You can cut around the block and then cut it up into pieces. Personally, I like having that paper in that seam allowance because I feel like it makes it easier to attach the pieces. You can see here that I am lining up the 1/4 inch line on the ruler so that I can cut my 1/4 inch seam allowance. First there's the side with the paper, and then I'm going to cut my 1/4 inch seam allowance on the other two sides, so I'm lining up the 1/4 inch line with the edge of the paper. Once I've done that, I'm going to take two pieces here, and in order to make sure that I've lined them up properly, I'm going to take a pin, and I'm going to put the pin through right where that line goes to the edge of the paper. And then I'm going to take the end of the pin and putting right sides of the fabric together, I'm going to put that pin through and match it where that line lines up with the edge of the paper on the other piece. Now that I've done that on one side, I'm going to do that on the other side. If it's not the outside of the block, then you're not going to have that extra paper, so you would be looking for the corner of the piece, and I'm going to put the pin through the very corner right beyond the paper, and I'm going to find the corner on the other side and put it through. This way I know that I've lined my edges up. Now technically, if you've cut your seam allowances exactly correctly, you should be able to just line up the fabric, but sometimes with the oddly shaped blocks it makes it difficult. So I've pinned these two together, and now I'm going to sew this seam. And finally you can see here, so here's my piece that I sewed together. You can see these two pieces, and I've ironed the seam out. Here's my whole block with all my different pieces ironed together.